topic, and I will talk about how I interpreted the topic and spend most of the time talking about my interpretation of the topic. But I actually want to begin with something not obvious about this question, the fast track to getting tenure, which is, do you want to do that? And I would say that it seems self-evident that, like, if I could get tenure earlier rather than later, why would I ever not want to do that? Let me propose to you a whole bunch of reasons why you might not want early tenure. Number one, we were just talking about this. Number one is when you go up for tenure or when you go up for full, your materials will be sent out to a whole bunch of people in the field who will be evaluating, like, how impressive your corpus of work is, and at the stage of just coming up for tenure, another year or two will make your corpus look even better, and those imprints that people get at the time, those mental snapshots they get of you, will be better if you've got more time. Number two, this sounds sneaky, but let me urge all of you to do this. There is basically, if you're happy with your job, there is 1 year in your career where you can go on the job market legitimately, even if you want to stay in your job, and it is the year that you are up for tenure. Because that is the year that you don't have job security, and you can go out and see what the market can bear. And maybe you'll find a better job, maybe you'll get a big raise, maybe you won't get anything. But it is the only year in your career where if you don't want to move and you want to maintain the highest integrity, that you can go on the market. That is it. So if, I mean, my chair was, I think, very savvy. I intended to do that because I think all of us should do that. And she snuck this early tenure thing on me. And by the way, I'm grateful for it, and she just meant well, so I don't mean to be critical. But I was highly ambivalent. Because, damn it, that was the one chance where I could, with integrity, go on the market. And then I was thinking, why don't I say no? And then with integrity, I could say, I don't know if I have job security, but I figured I really can't say that with integrity any longer. A third, not obvious if I found that. All right, maybe I'll come back to that. But did I say one of the things you were saying about that? Okay. All right, there was some other great idea about the here. So, I should give a little bit of background on me. I'm sort of embarrassed to do this. I presume that they wanted me to talk about the fast track thing because I have done stuff young, and so I'm going to give some background. I'm embarrassed this will be on the web. Sorry, everybody. I was fast. I got my bachelor's in '97, my master's in '99, my PhD in '01. I was put up early for tenure. I was put up several years early for full. I'm not totally sure. And I should say that even though I finished my PhD in 4 years, my master's and PhD in 4 years, every summer I took off at least 6 weeks, or sometimes the whole 3 months to lead wilderness expeditions or go backpacking or something like that. In fact, I don't even understand what people were doing that was taking 6 years. I was never able to figure it out. I work very hard. That is, I sit at my computer a whole lot of the time when I am, like, in the country. When I'm not doing something awesome, I'm usually seated at my computer because I like to do it and because it feels very satisfying to be productive. But I don't want to give the misimpression that all that speed came at the expense of living what I consider to be a rich, full life, right? Like, when I am not doing something awesome, I am working, right? Now, some people might want leisure and TV time more than I do indoors, so I don't spend much time doing that sort of stuff. I can remember, one of the major lessons, so I'm going to get to, like, a whole list of things that I'm happy to talk about that might be useful as you think about how to be productive in your early career, which is how I'm interpreting this topic. But I want to talk a little bit about a moment in my career. It happened during the summer after my first year in grad school, or maybe, you know what, I think it was the summer after my third semester in grad school. Because for me, it was a very distinct moment that was like a light bulb, eureka thing about how one does this thing called academic life, which should very clearly be distinguished from this thing called having great ideas, or this thing called, like, being brilliant, or this thing called, making important contributions, right? There is a way that a good academic functions that isn't necessarily the same thing as doing important work, being really smart, etc. Right? There's just a way to, like, I don't mean in a cynical way to say the way the game is played. So my second year, my third semester in grad school, late 1998, I was taking 2 courses at the same time at the University of North Carolina. The late, great Kara Rusbold was teaching close relationships. The not late, but also great Konstantin Sedekidis was teaching the self. And in the self, we had a day on this new model that had just come out called the strength model of self-regulation. And I think that same week, Carol Ruswell was talking about relationship maintenance mechanisms, things like accommodation, things that eventually became, stuff like forgiveness and so forth. And when I was reading these in the same week, just by chance, I had some interesting thoughts. So if you go back and read, this is considered a pretty big landmark paper in relationship science. This is Carroll's 1991 paper, and the definition of accommodation is the willingness when a partner has engaged in a potentially destructive act to inhibit impulses to react destructively and instead react constructively. And because I had just been reading about this thing called self-regulation and this Baumeister strength model, by the way, 1998 was the year that the first empirical papers were published. So this is about like 8 seconds after the first papers were published. I was reading both of these at the same time, and I thought, like, that's an obvious link. By the way, that obvious link, that is, I consider to be a pretty unimportant and unimpressive insight, if you want to think about like profundity of insight, became a JPSP paper and basically launched my career. So, you don't need to be some big fancy pants thinker to be able to publish a JPSP, right? Keith Campbell was a graduate student who was in his 5th year when I was in my 1st year at UNC. He had graduated and was doing a postdoc with Baumeister, and it just so happens that he was working on a paper with another graduate student. He came back to Northwestern, and to UNC, and I saw him in the hall and said, I had this idea, I just wrote up a paper for class, and like, do you think this could work? That like the sorts of depletion methods that Baumeister's innovating and these sorts of overcoming aggressive impulses in relationships that Ruswell's been talking about, like there's a synergy there, right? And he was like, yes. I went and sat down and I think like just drooled on myself. And about like 6 minutes later, he came in with a piece of paper that said study 1, study 2, study 3, study 4. And like, it was like, this is the first study, and then this is going to have these limitations, and then the second study, then we're going to have this thing here, and then the third study is going to rule out this alternative explanation, and the fourth study is really going to try to unpack mechanistic stuff with. I don't remember what was on that piece of paper, but for me, it was like an anvil on the head. No, better. It was like a snort of coke up the nose. All right. Yeah. So. What I realized in that moment, it was sort of like how a bill becomes a law thing. There's like this sausage making that comes into writing a paper. Now I'm talking really specifically about JPSP as like the prototype of that sort of paper. And it was mysterious to me. In my first year, I thought, well, there's this rarefied group of people that just knows how to do such amazing stuff that they end up in JPSP. And in a matter of about 6 minutes, Keith Campbell was like, it's gonna look like this. Now look, in fairness, the paper we published didn't just look like that, right? It's not that we had it all there, we just did that and then it was done. But it was that moment that I realized there is a formula here. There's a system that you sort of work through. And we did again, we published this and in my early career, it was definitely the most important thing that we had done. Okay, so with that background in mind, I want to just start some random thoughts. And I don't care that, I think I came up with 9. I don't care that I get to all of them, so please interrupt. And actually, I'm speaking also to the mentors here as well. Like interrupt, interject, disagree, ask questions, whatever. This is just a series of only very loosely oriented thoughts. But the first one is the one I was just building to, which is learn the JPSP formula. So if you could publish a paper in science, God bless, do it. But I still don't think it has a currency in terms of you getting a job and getting tenure as publishing a JPSP. I get that people think science is awesome, and frankly, it often is. But JPSP, what it says is not that you're brilliant and not that you're great. What it says is that you can take an idea, big or small, important or not particularly important, and really unpack it and think about it in a sophisticated way, work through the kinks, recognize the limitations of this research paradigm and that research paradigm. Now, I can't give you here the code, right, the JPSP formula, the code, because it depends on your area. Right, like I study relationships, and I can tell you can do this too, right? We can sort of tell you, if you want to publish a relationships type paper in JPSP, there's a way that is typically done. And it's easy for me, if people want to talk about a specific area and we can work through examples later, I'm happy to do it. All I want to say here is there is no magic. You need not be brilliant, but you need to be dogged, right? JPSP, it does not say that the person has any special skill. It says that person was dogged, was relentless enough, won a battle of attrition against reviewers, and over a long period of time has now succeeded in producing something that is pretty cool. I mean, most of the stuff we see in JPSP, at the end of it, it's not profound, but it's a solid piece of science, a very impressive program of research. Okay, moving on. By the way, do people have Any interruptions thus far? Okay. These ones I'll breeze through quickly. So if you don't have questions in the middle, jot questions as you go, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Yes.
Actually, I'll add something.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
To second what Eli said, I think there are a lot of things that go into publishing JPSP. You need to be creative enough, smart enough, and have good skills methodologically. But the thing that really does tie it all together is not just persistence, but persistence in the face of failure. And you really have to develop a thick skin. The way you put it is like war attrition against reviewers. The best paper is still going to be a super uphill battle, and it's going to feel like a battle sometimes, but you don't give up. You could win.
Yeah, when they say, like, you're a dumb idiot, and all these studies need to be dropped and replaced with other studies, but I might be willing to consider revision even though this one's totally rejected because it's so stupid, that's a celebration. Because that door is open. And once the door is open, you're actually on much better terms, because then you get to write a cover letter. Cover letters are the 9th level of hell. And yet, they are your ticket. The cover letter allows you to go literally every piece of minutia by every piece of minutia, through everything that the editor raised, everything that the reviewers raised, and say, bang, 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 bang. And it is bad faith on the part of the editor to have invited a revision and then got the revision that is 100% responsive. Now, sometimes you can't. They want you to run a study, you try running the study, the data aren't cooperative, right? It's not like you can do 100% of it. But if your impulse is to battle against the reviewers and say, reviewer one, that was sort of a foolish point, I would urge you to do that almost never. Almost never. I can't say never. There is I bet I have done it like 2 or 3 times in my life. Been like, that is wrong, and I'm not going to go down that road. Because the little tweak to your paper, like get over that like mild integrity thing that you think you're sacrificing by saying, okay, we said this is an alternative explanation, and we thank reviewer 3 for his enormous insight. Right? Just practice it in the mirror. If you find yourself having this set of thoughts, you're in trouble. I want to collect more data, but my subject pool isn't big enough. And
Eli.
yes.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
Sorry.
Hey, Mike.
How are you?
Great.
I was talking to 2 different editors of prestigious journals who would like to remain nameless. But when you said, like, if they say this is the worst paper I've ever seen, but maybe you can send it back later if you become a new person. They said there's a huge gender difference.
Oh, wow.
On the likelihood that people will interpret that as go to hell or the door's open.
And I think we all can guess which way it goes. That's
Exactly. So just as a piece of
I'm really glad you said that.
that's not an opinion, that's like hard data.
Yeah.
Women don't push back as much as men. If you are.
My guess is that you push back several times. I push back. My guess is that you push back, and yeah, I don't know. Are you a pusher?
I don't.
No, you're not a pusher.
But I do know that, and I've started to think more about how to do that. And
Here's the criterion, and I guess maybe I'm talking more of the women, not the men. The criterion for saying they welcome a resubmission is absolutely minimal. It is, especially at JPSP, or a JPSP-like paper, like journal in another field, right? If it is like you're dumb and ugly and stinky and your data suck and your theory's stupid, and so I'm rejecting this outright. But if you rerun all your studies and become, as you said, a new person, then I'm willing to consider a revision. Please consider that a revision. A revised resubmit, unless you're saying, I don't want to battle. And that would be part of the gender difference too, actually, right? So if it's like, oh, that's going to be such an uphill fight and I can't be bothered, that's your call, but that's not the way to maximize the placement of your science in the most prestigious terms. When you think, I don't have enough subjects in my subject, or that's hard to do on MTurk, and you whine about it, you should tell your own self to shut up. The field, the world is large. Possibilities are robust. Do not feel limited. You are lazy if you're going like 2 or 3 semesters in a row, being like, oh, I just don't have the subject. It's like, you study eating, go talk to people at the local food mart. You know, you want to study romantic relationships, go do some study in a bar and study hand-holding. Hit the pavement, talk to proprietors of institutes. I'm making these up because I can't come up with a general enough thing that will encompass all of your research interests. But please, think ambitiously. And not only in the sense of don't limit yourself to intro to psych and MTurk, for example, but also think ambitiously like, what's the idea that I want to test? what would blow my mind? What would be just the best way to do it? Is it a intensive longitudinal study? Boy, I don't have the money for that, but you often do. There's often little internal grants, and you often don't need to pay as much as you think. Like, don't think right away what's possible. What sort of the possible way for me to study this? The first thought you should have is, what is the awesomest way? What is the way that will knock off my own socks and reviewers' socks, and that when I go for a job talk or my tenure materials go out to a whole range of senior scientists, they're like, that was a good study, right? And that is not the same as the standard jpsp study, right? But I urge strongly, like, don't think narrowly about what's possible in terms of your studies. More is possible than you think, as long as you hit the pavement and ask. And actually, it occurs to me, if the women don't ask, thing generalizes here, it's plausible that women might feel less comfortable than men being like, hi, can I use your establishment as a place to collect data? But please do it if you want to make large contributions to the science. I don't have much to say about this, except that speaking skills matter more than they should. So, people, independent of the quality of your scholarship, will remember your talks at conferences. Obviously, some of you are grad students, right? Your job talk matters more than it should, and I don't want to add even more stress, but it's going to matter a lot because let's say you're a social psychologist and you come up and like, you know, we're the existing faculty and we say, this person's amazing, the CV is great, and you know, you sort of flubbed the job talk or feel like you didn't really convey it as well as you could have. Somebody in cognitive is like, I don't think so, right? And I'm exaggerating a little, but my department makes decisions by consensus. If somebody raises a real objection, that's a problem, right? And basically, the only people who really know what you're doing are the social psychologists, but you would like to leave no room for the clinical psychologist, the cognitive psychologist, the developmental psychologist, or anybody else, like leave no room for somebody to be like, I don't know. Like, that didn't really hang together well, and the theoretical integration wasn't good, or the transition between studies didn't really tell a nice narrative. This is a skill that is developable, right? There's obviously individual differences in extroversion or whatever else, but there's no reason why people should be giving a bad talk. There's no reason other than laziness or unwillingness to train yourself on how to do it. You can't, not everybody's going to be able to be a Mike Norton, who's I think one of the best speakers I've ever seen, but there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to give a damn solid talk that should, on a conference or a job search, like, do the job for you. Fourth out of 9. So I'm now getting into like life management stuff. So, does anybody here have an inbox? Not today, because we're at a conference, that often has more than 100 in it? lots of nodding, but yeah. It is difficult for me to imagine not feeling frazzled under those circumstances. I may well be more attentive about this than most people, that is plausible. But it seems almost impossible to stay on top of your life, make sure you're not missing deadlines and responsibilities, disappointing collaborators, failing to get back to students before the exam, etc., if your inbox is spiraling out of control. Now, in a very realistic sense, what my job is managing my inbox. You could argue that that is basically the thing that I do. It just so happens that the things that are in my inbox are like drafts of papers from co-authors, and you know, I need to send a paper to a co-author, etc., or I need to get my syllabus submitted or whatever else. But a massive amount of my daily time, and probably others, is inbox time. Now, some people manage this in different sorts of ways. Some people like set aside an hour every evening or something like that. I just stay on it all the time. I don't necessarily advocate for that particular approach, but I very strongly advocate that you don't let it get the better of you, or at least if it does, fix it as soon as possible, because it'll probably affect the rest of the things you're trying to work on if you're confused or don't have a sense of the big picture, which if your inbox is out of control, that's probably the case. I know people who play, this is going to sound like I'm joking, I know people who play fantasy social psychology. Anybody ever play like fantasy baseball or fantasy football? Raise your hands. Anybody? Nobody in this room has played fantasy? Okay, you have. Right? So you get the idea. Like there's like batting average and you like want to win that category, and then there's like rebounds, right? Obviously I'm switching sports. But I know people who play fantasy social psychology. Anyone ever heard of this? Sort of awesome. I have not actually played. And what I've learned from talking to the people who play fantasy social psych is that there is basically nobody, except almost nobody, who publishes more than about 2 first author papers a year. When I'm talking about the most productive people in the field, it's pretty rare that somebody has an average of more than 2 first author publications in a year. What really separates the people who have 5, 10, 15 papers in a year usually is collaborations, right? If you are an effective collaborator, you can massively, massively increase your productivity. Let's imagine an extreme case where you and 3 co-authors are all working together on a series of 4 papers, and all of you are competent enough and conscientious collaborators enough that each of you is first on one and like shepherds it through in a year. That's very realistic, right? That somebody could do this within the course of a year, right? That you could write 1 paper and get it submitted. But now that's 4. You're first author on 1, but that's 4 papers, yes.
So how does that count, for example, first author?
How do later author papers count toward like tenures and it's not, so I would say appropriately that first author papers are weighted much more heavily. I would also say that if you're publishing your 2 first author papers a year and nothing else, you will eventually seem unproductive. Again, look, maybe the field's wrong. There's been debate about, are we publishing too many papers or whatever. But I guess I would say that you should be doing your work, that you are the lead guy on or gal, and that at the same time, you should be like shepherding through or helping to foster through work that your co-authors or your mentor or your students are taking the lead on. Anybody want to add that in terms of different universities, first author, later author?
I mean, we like to see first author papers and stuff that's not with your advisor because then that looks like too much dependency. And yeah, but you can't be always the 5th author either.
Right.
So a mix is good.
That's right.
So in terms of the doing it well part, some collaborations you find that the resulting a lot of diffusion of responsibility and
Yes.
you finding out having to do more work.
I have had a lot of collaborations, and there is a massive spectrum here. And I can't claim that it's all my collaborators, right? Like, I'm sure there's actor variants, partner variants, and relationship variants. I probably collaborate better with some people than with others. There's no question about that. On my CV, I'm almost positive that there's more than 100 names of co-authors of mine over the years, right? So I've collaborated a lot, and it is one of the reasons why I've been productive, promoted early, etc. So the main way to be a good collaborator, above all else, is be responsive. This is, again, one of these sort of what I was saying about jpsp. You don't have to be brilliant, but you have to be dogged. I'm not saying it is sufficient to be a good collaborator to be responsive, but I think that is number 1. And what do I mean by responsive? Either get back to your collaborator right away, or get back right, with the actual response or what the person's waiting on you for, or alternatively get back right away and say, I'm snowed under, but I think within 48 hours I can take a look at this, right? And but what sucks is for me to send something to you and be like, hey, I've been working on it and I think we're getting closer, but I'm really struggling here and there, and then it's like, crickets, right? Don't let anybody else hear the crickets. I one other thing about that. I forgot.
But how can you, is there a way to find good, have good collaborations? I mean, other than what we do.
Well, I think that's number 1. Yeah. And I remember what I was going to say too. Oh, so I have had a motto. I don't know that I still have this, but for a long time I had a motto or a slogan or a credo, maybe is the way to say it, which is never get in the way of a motivated first author. I drop almost uniformly, although it's gotten a little harder as I've gotten more and more collaborations, but almost uniformly, no matter what I'm doing, paper comes into the inbox that you're first author on and I'm some later author on, I get to it immediately. It is, I would say over the course of my career, I've been a little less good lately, but over the course of my career, I think it is fair to say that more than half the time I've replied same day, and I bet it has been very rare that it's been more than 24 hours, right? This, if you have a motivated and competent first author, never, ever, ever let that person start focusing on something else. You're like, okay, well, I sent it to her, I'm going to start turning my attention elsewhere, because then you could have 4 or 6 months delay. In terms of, I'm not exaggerating that at all. It's like then they turn to another paper, and that's the priority for a while, and then by the time you get the feedback, then there's this huge delay. Don't muck up the gears. In terms of being a good collaborator, I do think responsiveness is number 1, but it depends on the nature of what your role is on the paper. So if you're really helping with some complex stats, right? I mean, that's going to be straightforward. Do people have ideas about what it is that makes you a sort of a better, worse collaborator in a general sense? Obviously responsiveness, but anything else?
Do more than your fair share.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you're working on a paper that you're not first author on, and you see a paragraph that could be reworked, rather than sticking a comment in and saying, oh, I think this paragraph could really use
I have become picky. I have become pickier. I mean, that's the thing, is as you get more senior, I remember early in grad school, I bet all of us had this, early in grad school, it's like, I don't know, how do you have a research idea? Like, and then it doesn't take long before it's like, oh my gosh, like, when am I ever going to get to test everything? That's exciting. And so yes, I too have turned down, I used to just collaborate on everything, I'm like prone toward excitement. Awesome, let's do that. And then finally I was like, I'm being defeated by my enthusiasm, and I didn't chill. So yeah, I would say that the best thing to do is to find people you're really compatible with, you really trust them to do their parts, and then double down.
I would just add, I agree with all that, just add two things. One is, if you're trying to pick someone to collaborate with, maybe pick someone who has shown that they collaborate well with others. So if someone does not publish many papers, and if they do, they're all sole author, it doesn't mean that they're impossible to collaborate with, but it might. And if someone collaborates effectively with lots of different people, either they're very charming or they're probably a good collaborator. And the other thing is, when I start collaborating with a new person, I almost always start 2 projects, because chances are at least one will bomb. And if you start working with someone on one thing that bombs, it's you both are like, this is lousy, let's not do this anymore. But if you do 2, first off, one might work, but also you kind of get the you're in charge of this and I'm in charge of this one, and that can set a dynamic of who's in charge of what, instead of both of you just saying, why isn't he or she working on this thing and I'm getting this.
I never thought of that, that's great.
I would add one more thing. Sometimes you don't find out about your collaborators until this project has started and that's why. And then my priorities will shift depending on who's the motivator collaborator and who's not. So projects with a motivated collaborator will come higher into my inbox, and I'll do them faster. And projects
Did everyone hear that?
I don't hear back after a long time, it will just drop.
Yeah.
Even though my initial idea may have been, I may have been interested, but it's not moving fast enough, then I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, I will almost try to be like, I hope I don't hear progress, because then there'll be something I'll have to do, and then there'll be another ancient wait. Yeah. There's no real way to be super productive other than this. I mean, there's variability in how productive a sole author person can be, but this is the secret to large productivity, right? And it often happens, so my collaborations are often things like, you know, I'm working on something and then I find out somebody else has a cool data set, and then we find out somebody else has a cool data set. And so you end up with like 8 or 9 authors on a paper. It's like, well, there were the 3 of us, and then there were the 3 of you, and then it was you 2. God bless, right? Like, who cares, right? The more the merrier, as long as everybody's contributing, right? It's always good. 6 out of 9. So this is such a broad, sort of self-evident bullet point. Let me just say a couple of concrete things about it. Earlier I mentioned that I got through grad school fast, despite the fact that I took off either half or all of the 3 grad school summers. And then I said, well, usually if I'm at my computer, I'm really attempting to be productive, right? So you yourself know how much time you spent on Facebook, and if you don't know, you should start getting a sense of it, right? And I don't know, you guys are probably too old to know what Facebook is, but whatever it is that you like crazy kids do these days, like you're probably wasting, some of you are probably wasting a lot of time. So I guess, and it's not just wasting time on Facebook, it's like, how much time are you spending preparing this lecture? And I am so guilty on this. When I'm like prepping something new, I take forever. In fact, the 5th or the 6th time, I forget, that I taught Intro to Psych. Now, Intro to Psych doesn't change much from year to year. Freud has nothing new to say, right? And neither does Skinner or Watson or Pavlov or Milgram, right? And yet every year I was slogging through and finding new video stimuli, and I went through that every time. And I think it was the 6th time through. I said, I'm going to do this one more time, because I got a new cache of cool videos that I was going to process, and I will never do this again, because the course evaluations are always the same, right? The students are equally happy regardless. Like, what am I doing to myself? And I tell you, thank God they made that change, because I think the class is basically as good as if I were killing myself, and I have a whole lot more time for research. So that's one example, and I have not always been that efficient. The egregious cases are things like social media and so forth, but often it's work-related tasks that are sapping what you really could be doing much more efficiently, right? And if you're sitting there staring at a blank computer screen about writing, you should force yourself to write literally gibberish. I don't care what it is. You can start writing the digits of pi, but stop sitting there and drooling on yourself. right? You've got to figure out a way, get words onto that page, break through whatever that inertia is that you're fighting, and just start writing. There's no magic to writing, right? Just sit there and then just begin. Anything else about time use in the, like time use when you're sort of working on work stuff, doing it efficiently? Okay, yes.
Find your peak writing time.
Yeah.
Protect that time.
Yeah, so lots of people do have time where they're both most mentally sharp, morning people, evening people, whatever, and protect that time. Harder, you protect it with like a bludgeon and an axe, because there's the demands will be extreme. Who does this, by the way? So among the faculty here, do you actually like have time that's like nobody gets that time?
7 to 10.
7 to 10 a.m.
I don't respond to email.
Wow. Do you?
Every morning,
From what to what?
till noon. I don't do meetings till after.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
5 to 7.
A.m.
Oh, boy.
Kids.
Oh yeah. Do you have?
And I also don't, I never teach during my good thinking time.
Yeah.
Did you say that
Same
before?
here.
Okay, yeah, so I teach in the afternoon when I'm not really, so I mean, I think, I've been teaching for 20 years, you know, so it's pretty automatic to say that, but, like you said, it's nothing really new, but the writing is the hardest part, and that's where you want to be most mentally fresh, yeah.
I have been less, like I always dream of like forcing myself these exact hours or this exact number of words. I've never been that great about it, but I wish I were better. So learn from these other folks. And I do actually protect time to write, it's just less systematic. But just as important about being mindful about your use of work time, be mindful about your use of non-work time. And this is actually the thing I was talking about before, in terms of you want to lead a 6-week wilderness trip? Do it. That's a great use of your life. You want to watch a lot of television? That's up to you, right? It's up to you. But I think you're wasting your time. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration, but look, some people like lying on the beach and the sun like shines on them, and I find that incredibly boring. So it's sort of up to you. The only thing I would say is, if you're not working, be doing something good, please. Don't just not work because it's 5 p.m. or whatever else. And again, maybe this is the wrong mentality. But my job is to talk about getting early tenure, and I tell you this is a good strategy for getting early tenure, right? It's not that I work so much that I'm a workaholic and I don't do other good stuff with my life. But my threshold for what's going to get me away from my work is high. It's got to be something sort of awesome, because working is sort of awesome. So it's got to be above that threshold, and it often is. Like I have a family, I like seeing even my kids every once in a while. I like to see, and my wife for sure I like to see. And just kidding, little guys. But you know, there's a cool trip you could take. There's something really worth it. Do it. Blow off work as much as you want for that sort of thing. But please don't waste hours just because. I mentioned this at the table earlier. Don't whine about having to write grant proposals. It's a fair thing for your employer to expect you to do. Right? Your employer is, I know we like all the freedom we get in our job, but the way the economics of higher education work is that there are indirect costs. And first of all, getting a grant is good for your research program. Second, and actually even applying for a grant that you don't get is not necessarily bad for your research program, because you're learning a lot from the process. But it is fair for your employer to say, it'd sure be nice if you were trying to get grants. It is a fair request. So you should, and I would actually urge you, I don't know how many are grad students here, I would urge you to do this during your first semester as a faculty member. Not because you're going to be so settled and organized, actually precisely because you won't be. Precisely because no matter when they tell you your lab is going to be ready, very likely it is not going to be ready. Right? Precisely because you don't have the undergrad system up and running yet, this is the time. And it's also a good time to be thinking, boy, like, okay, like let's say I get a grant and it comes in a year from now, and then over the next 5 years, that'll be about tenure time. It forces you to think a little bit like, who do I want to be when my letters go out to, when my CV and materials go out to potential letter writers. The other thing that's advantageous about writing grants, I have right here, which is you should not be wasting your time writing a grant proposal. I know it's easy to think, like, I can either write a paper or a grant proposal, and there's a trade-off, and that's not false. That's not an incorrect way to think. But a really constructive and frequently viable way to think is to think of a grant proposal as work toward a review paper. It's like, what do you think is in your area really sort of big and ambitious? Like, what's the field look like in 5 years in your relatively narrow area of interest, but what does it look like, right? And a lot of people have turned grant proposals into reviews, into review papers and vice versa, and one thing that's awesome is that you can plagiarize your own grant proposals in ways that you can't plagiarize your own articles and other articles, right? It is the same text, often, that goes in both places. So view it as an opportunity rather than as a frustration, and also view it as a responsibility and do it graciously. And this is my last one. Okay. I'm assuming I'm talking to people who have not been personally invited by editors very frequently to write chapters. You're sort of too junior to have gotten a whole lot of those. It is flattering to be asked, especially the first time. It's like, wow, that editor is somebody I really admire and look up to, and probably is in your area, right? And it sure would feel bad to say no to something like this. And it's an opportunity to share some new ideas. I've been thinking about it before. Chapters take for frickin' ever. They take a long time to write. So don't think there is such a thing as a quick and dirty publication. There are gods out there for whom that is true. It is certainly not true for me. Right? Chapters take a long time. And in fact, I would probably say that writing a good chapter takes almost as much time as writing a good article, assuming the data are collected. Yes.
One senior faculty member once said, being asked to write a chapter is like being given a beautiful flower, and actually having to write that chapter is like eating the flower.
Yeah, that's perfect. I would say, so I actually was I'm trying to be a little more strategic about saying yes to stuff, because I generally default to excitement. And I went through and I checked my own H index. Right? How many papers do you have that were cited that number of times? How many chapters are there? I think one. How many chapters have I written? A lot. Right? The likelihood that you will write a chapter that 5-10 years from now will be cited enough to have made it worth you writing that chapter is very low. But I want to emphasize this. If it's early enough, if you're in year 2 and you're not ready to write anything yet, you don't have enough data yet, even in year 3 this can happen, even in year 4 this can happen, right? But you feel like it's not like you have something else to write, and maybe your mentor is the one who got invited, and your mentor says, it's up to you, we can take this one and you can be first author, or we can just decline it, you let me know. Then that chapter you take, because you hone your craft. You learn the skills that you need to learn to be able to write. By the way, what does it look like to decline a chapter? So has anyone actually been personally invited and had to decline a chapter? I'm not talking about the senior people, but among the more junior people. So allow me to show you the text that I used to decline the chapter recently. I was invited by 2 editors whom I personally love and respect enormously. And did it feel good to say no? It felt bad. And this is what I wrote. Dear XXX, not because they're corny, but you get the idea. I'm delighted to be invited, and I think I would enjoy writing a chapter for this volume. I'm afraid, however, that you catch me at a moment, by the way, this is true, when I have solemnly vowed not to write any more chapters for edited volumes. Given that I knew tempting offers like this one would arrive, I even vowed to give myself no discretion to reconsider my vow. As such, I really have no choice but to decline or to rot in vow-breaker hell. I'm truly sorry that I can't contribute to this volume, which sounds like it'll be magnificent. Look, is it possible that these 2 individuals, whom I respect immensely, are angry with me? I suppose. Seems unlikely, right? This is a very reasonable thing to say. But that's not a reason to spend a month or 2 of your writing time working on a chapter. I just want you to be aware that saying yes to a chapter is an easy thing to do. Writing a chapter is so much more work than you think. By the way, I'm not talking about the Handbook of Social Psychology or Advances in Experimental Social Psychology. Write those chapters. But standard edited volume chapters. And that is all I've got. Anybody have any comments, questions? I don't know if we have time. Did anybody have anything to add or any questions? I'm delighted to chat or field questions.
So you will actually wait around and the papers, so
Which is more important?
publication versus grant?
Publication versus grant. Well, here's the deal. You will likely have by the time you are up for tenure, you will likely have a number of publications. Let's call it north of 10 and maybe well north of 10. So grants is like a separate category. So I guess what I would say is I would say get a jpsp paper. That's probably for a social psych person, and unless people disagree, I still think that's probably the single best currency. Does this seem right? One jpsp paper, and even better than a psych science, possibly even better than a science paper. certainly better than like a PSP or something like that. I'm not criticizing any of those outlets, they're all awesome. I think JPSP still remains like the golden currency of this person is a serious scholar in social psychology or personality psychology. Grants will de facto become more important if you haven't gotten one, because by the time you're going up for tenure, it's likely you'll have had, again, maybe 20 publications, maybe only 2 or 3 are first author JPSP type things, right? But still, the grant box is unchecked. So the question is this: do you want somebody with 3 first author JPSPs, 20 overall publications, and 1 nice grant, or 4 JPSPs, 20 overall publications, and no grant? So I think it is pretty useful to get yourself a grant along the way, because there's no doubt that people who are, most of us will end up along the way publishing papers, and usually some percentage of those will be strong.
Yeah, I think the way you put it is right. When it comes to publishing, it's not a box that you check off, it's about the overall quantity and quality of your work. With getting grants to get tenure, usually it is a box that you check off. You get a grant and you're good to go.
Right. And if you're in that position and you're coming up toward tenure, it's worth sacrificing the first author JPSP to put that on. Again, I don't mean to be so pragmatic. Obviously, we're talking about the quality of the science and all that stuff, but I'm trying to be just on the pragmatic side of this conversation.
Any tips on how to find collaborators?
How to find collaborators. So I collaborated with fellow grad students. So Keith Campbell was one of my collaborators. He was a fellow grad student at Northwestern. Obviously, I collaborate with my own graduate students. I often end up collaborating with people. So because I often have like more ambitious, labor-intensive data sets, because I'm a relationships researcher, and most of the people in the field are not. They're more likely to have 2x2 experiments. I have some of those too, obviously. But it often happens. So earlier in my career, I came to SPSP and I heard talks, and I was like, boy, I've got cool findings. And I would like, I've got relevant data. And this only happened, I think, a couple of times, but just in an illustrative way that I have done it. I went, I analyzed my data, I replicated what I saw in the talk, and was like, don't know if you want to add it or not. You know, it would be, you know, depending on how many people it would be just me as an author or not, whatever. But it's up to you. Like, if this adds to your overall story, and it usually did. And people were delighted to like add an author and get a great study. But that's an extreme case. I don't think that's the standard way people begin. I'm actually trying to illustrate the various ways that these things happen. What'll happen increasingly, I don't know how senior you are, but what'll happen increasingly is the same people will go to your pre-conference year in, year out. You'll eventually like develop friends with the same sorts of interests, etc. And so it sort of becomes clear, like you and I are interested in the same sorts of things. And I think almost always it's to the good to collaborate. And I mean, if you're at the same school, is that dangerous? Collaborate with people at the same school as you? I think it's, your senior colleagues maybe. Yeah, your senior colleagues maybe. But otherwise it's just to the good. Did anybody, how else do people collaborate? Mike, you and I collaborated on a paper recently because we were haters. So Mike published a paper challenging a basic idea of relationship science. We said Mike Norton's full of crap. Mike Norton said Eli Finkel's full of crap. We decided to write a paper.
I actually called you an ass face.
I was trying to tone it down. And we just wrote an adversarial collaboration. It was a delightful experience. So, I mean, it happens all the time. Like you just end up chatting about something at a conference and you collaborate. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions how to develop a coherent, like focused line of work?
I suck at that. You're good at that. So how do you do like really programmatic? I'm just a dilettante. I find too many. Mike, you have this problem too, don't you? Like just too many things. It's not that you're not programmatic, but you have a lot of lines of work. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah. I have that too. And I would say that I like it. It's fun, but I would say that it's not the best way to build a career. Right? You have to be pretty productive in each of them, and it's a pretty dangerous route. You have a lot of interest too, but I think you've been a little more programmatic. I think you want to talk a little bit about that.
I think it's just important to nail down at some point what your research is about. And that sounds easy, but it's not as easy as it sounds. So you have to be able to define yourself, your research persona. And once you do that, just try to stick close to home. So when you're, if you've got 5 different ideas that you're trying to sort through and figure out which one you want to pursue, one factor to weigh is how closely aligned is it with your research persona, and does it fit into your program of research?
And I never do that, but I wish I did. I really am absolutely horrible at this. But like I said, you can get away with it, but you have to be really productive to succeed. And another thing that I think, I don't know what when you say research persona, it means a couple things, I think, but one of the things that it means that may not be obvious is, are people in the field going to be able to say, hey, John Maynard, he's the blah, blah, blah guy. and work out, right? And it's pretty valuable for people to be like, have an immediate association. The problem is, so I do some work on progression, I'm trying to do some work on eating, I do some work on marriage, and I don't think those people know that I have other lines of work. I published a New York Times op-ed recently, and one of my good friends, and we overlap a lot of research, said, I had no idea you did research on self-regulation and relationships. She really had no clue. And I was like, that's 90% of what I do, right? But she just, she knows my initial attraction. So, and I think that's probably bad. I think that's a bad thing, yeah.
A good litmus test is when you go on the job market and you submit your application materials, you're going to have to submit a research statement where in just 2 to 3 pages you define your whole yourself as a researcher. So anytime you're thinking about pursuing a new project, you think about how is this going to fit into my research statement? Will it fit? If it doesn't, you might want to back burner it.
I wish I got that last year, yeah.
Yeah, so we were actually talking about it at our mentoring table about that research statement. And so if you wait for a couple more talks, when I talk about the grant writing one, I'll talk about it because that's the whole thing of writing grants is programmatic research. So yeah, so long answer would be a little bit.
Did I say anything inconsistent when I talked about grants? Did I say anything that was inconsistent?
No, in fact, your points 2, 3, and 5
Are all
were
over.
all in my time.
Okay, sorry about that. You'll really nail it home.
That's
Right?
good, that's good.
How are we on time? Should I have one more question?
Maintaining that kind of high, quality you seem to have in your policy, what's your criteria?
The high what?
Like, you seem like a very, you follow research, you rely on studies.
Yeah.
What's your criteria for when you think you see research projects kind of hit a wall? Time to back away from something else, you don't like lose time in something that doesn't seem to be working out.
I think the data eventually tell you. I don't know that I have. I don't know that I have a real answer, except that what it is. It's sort of like what you were talking about earlier with the collaborator who gets back to you right away versus the collaborator who takes forever versus is very responsive. Is eventually it gets less fun. So I actually don't know. And other people might have very concrete rules for this, and it's probably a good idea. I don't think I do. But you eventually start being like, I've tried 3 or 4 times, and it's not like you necessarily have a thing that's like, oh, I guess I was wrong. I guess maybe there's some of that. It's more like time is limited. You're going to go forward with something, and you in your own mind are sort of probabilistic about what's going to pay dividends, what's going to be fun to do, what's likely to be published. So I think it's, I don't exaggerate. I think it's a little self-fulfilling. That it's sort of like eventually the project just dies, and you just let it peter out. Does that anybody have anything to add?
I think some of it will, I agree. I think that intrinsic motivation is key, but I think it also depends on what else you have on your plate. If you have other projects that are good contenders, you shift the balance
Okay,
slowly in the direction of the ones that are good and are intrinsically motivating and are producing. But if you have nothing else, then that's fine.
Okay, thanks everybody.